The village lay tucked between jagged mountains, a place where the air was sharp with cold and the wind whispered through the sparse pine trees. Rare snow had come early this year, blanketing the earth in a pristine silvery layer that reflected the pale morning light. Children ventured outside for brief moments, their laughter muffled by scarves and woolen wraps, while the older villagers hurried to gather firewood, their breaths curling in misty clouds. The snow was an unusual visitor, and with it came stories and old warnings whispered through generations, that it could be both a giver and a taker, a force of nature imbued with mystical powers, rewarding those who were just and punishing those whose hearts were cruel. In the midst of this frozen landscape lived Sod, a young woman known throughout the village for her courage and sharp mind. Even in the harshest winters, she moved with purpose, her steps firm upon the slippery paths that wound between the snow-laden huts. Her eyes were dark and resolute, reflecting intelligence and determination, and her heart carried both compassion and a streak of unyielding bravery. She had learned from her mother how to survive the biting cold, to read the signs in the wind, and to respect the subtle forces of nature that seemed to breathe through the trees and rocks. In Sada's presence, one could sense a quiet strength, an inner fire that no winter could extinguish. But the warmth of her spirit was threatened by Kofi, her supposed lover. Handsome and persuasive, Kofi had charmed the village women and often boasted of his cleverness, but beneath the surface lay a man driven by greed and desire, one who did not honor the trust of those who loved him. His betrayal was no secret. The village murmured about his careless promises and hidden betrayals. Sod, who had once trusted him, now felt the sting of his deceit, though she masked her pain with calm determination. She had faced many hardships before, but the betrayal cut deeply, not just at her heart, but at the very rhythm of her daily life. Kofi's charm could not obscure his cruelty, and the snow, silent witness to all things, seemed to grow heavier as if attuned to the injustice being committed. The village itself was a quiet observer of the unfolding tensions. Smoke spiraled from chimneys, mixing with the cold air, and the crunch of snow underfoot echoed along narrow paths. Rare as it was, the snow carried significance beyond its physical presence. Elders whispered to one another that the snow could awaken old powers, that it could bend to the will of nature's justice, rewarding bravery and punishing deceit. As Sod moved about her daily chores, tending fires, fetching water, and helping her neighbors navigate the icy streets, she could feel the weight of these stories pressing gently against her consciousness. The wind, cold and sharp, seemed to murmur advice, warning her that the coming days would test her strength, her courage, and the very endurance of her spirit. Sada's thoughts often wandered to Kofi, who lingered in her mind not because of affection, but because of the wrongs he had committed. She knew that his heart was fickle, swayed by the slightest charm or opportunity, and that his actions were bound to have consequences beyond his understanding. And yet, she also knew the snow would not act for her vengeance. It moved according to a different set of rules, those of balance, justice, and unseen forces older than any village elder could recall. The rare snow had already begun to weave its silent magic across the rooftops and into the forest edges, sparkling in the faint light of dawn, as if listening and watching. The morning light reflected on the icy roofs, revealing footprints that told stories of hurried movement, of care and of treachery, and Sod noticed the patterns instinctively. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from anticipation of what the snow might reveal. She wrapped her cloak tighter, eyes scanning the horizon where the white mountains met the gray sky, sensing the hush of the forest and the quiet judgment it held. The villagers, going about their tasks, sensed the unusual stillness in the air, a pause that hinted that nature itself was waiting, watching for the next act of human frailty or courage. Even as Sod prepared herself for the coming days, Kofi moved obliviously through the village, unaware of the forces aligning against him. The snow, gentle and cold, seemed almost alive, pressing silently on rooftops, winding through narrow alleys, and brushing across the branches of trees, leaving delicate icy patterns in its wake. Every flake that settled carried with it a memory of justice, a quiet power that promised to intervene when the time was right. And Sod, standing on the edge of the village, feeling the icy wind against her face, understood instinctively that the snow was not merely a winter's whim, but a herald of something greater, something that would balance the scales of betrayal, cruelty, and endurance. Thus, in the biting cold of a rare African winter, amidst the whispers of the villagers and the unseen eyes of the snow, Sada's story began. A tale of betrayal, resilience, and the mysterious, quiet power of nature had begun to weave itself into the frozen landscape, preparing for the reckoning that was sure to come. The snow, silent yet sentient, had already chosen its witness, and Sod, brave and clever, stood ready to meet both its challenge and its justice. The snowstorm arrived with little warning, sweeping down from the high mountains and smothering the village in a blinding white haze. The wind tore through the streets, howling like a chorus of unseen spirits, whipping Sada's cloak around her and biting at any skin it could find. Her breath formed icy clouds in the freezing air, and each step through the drifts required careful balance against the slick, frozen ground. The world around her had become unrecognizable. Huts blurred behind the whirling snow, and familiar paths vanished beneath a thick, glistening blanket. Even the sound of her own heartbeat seemed muffled, absorbed into the furious roar of the storm. Kofi had promised to accompany her through the first hours of the winter celebration, assuring her that he would remain by her side. Yet, as the winds intensified, he vanished, leaving Sad alone on the threshold of the village. One moment he was beside her, murmuring empty reassurances. The next he was gone, swallowed by the storm as if he had never been there at all. Sad called after him, her voice almost lost in the howling gusts, but no reply came. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, yet she forced herself to steady her breathing. She was alone, exposed to the full wrath of the snow, abandoned by the very man she had trusted with her heart. The snow itself seemed to taunt her, forming jagged drifts that scratched against her cloak and boots. Icicles dangled from eaves and branches, glinting like tiny blades poised to pierce any unwary traveler. Each step became a careful negotiation with the icy terrain. The frozen mud threatened to catch her foot, sending her sprawling, and her hands grew numb from the bitter cold. Yet even as her body trembled, Sada's mind remained alert. She remembered her mother's teachings: read the signs in the wind, listen to the whispers of the trees, and trust in the strength that comes from courage, not fear. Her resolve hardened with every gust that threatened to knock her down. The village itself seemed ghostly in the storm. The few villagers who braved the snow moved quickly, heads down, barely visible through the white blur. Doors were shut tight against the wind, chimneys smoked erratically, and the bells of the distant shrine clanged faintly, sounding almost like a warning. The forest beyond the village, normally a comforting presence, loomed ominously, shadows stretching long and unwelcoming across the snow. Yet within that fearsome wilderness, Sad felt a strange presence, a faint stirring in the wind, a whisper almost too subtle to recognize but undeniable. It was as if nature itself had taken notice of the injustice unfolding, whispering promises of unseen watchfulness, of a balance waiting to be restored. Exhaustion clawed at her body, but Sad refused to succumb. She pressed forward, step by step, despite icy cuts on her hands and the relentless sting of the snow against her face. Memories of Kofi's betrayal stoked a fire in her chest. The same man who had once shared laughter and whispered words of love had left her to face death alone, and that betrayal could not be ignored. But the fire in her spirit was tempered by wisdom. She knew that anger alone could not save her. Survival demanded cleverness, courage, and an acute awareness of the forces around her. The snow, unpredictable and magical, seemed to respond to her resolve. Whispers of shifting drifts and the soft crackling of ice beneath her feet hinted that the storm was not merely a natural occurrence. It was a living force, attentive to injustice, observing her struggle. Hours passed like an eternity as Sad navigated the frozen landscape, each step a testament to her resilience. Her clothing, damp with melting snow, clung to her trembling frame, and her fingers, numbed by frost, fumbled to keep her balance. Yet in her eyes burned a fierce determination. She would survive not just for herself, but because she sensed a larger purpose in her endurance. The wind carried faint murmurs, almost like voices, reminding her that no cruelty goes unnoticed, that the world has ways of answering betrayal. Though Kofi had abandoned her, Sad knew she was not truly alone. The snow, patient and observing, was her silent companion, waiting for the moment when balance would be restored. As night approached, the storm's fury seemed to lessen slightly, revealing a sky heavy with clouds and stars struggling to peek through. Sad, shivering yet unbroken, paused to look back at the village now hidden under a veil of white. Kofi was gone, the cruel promise of his absence etched into her memory, but the snow whispered softly around her, promising that this betrayal would not be the end. There was justice yet to come, carried on the winds, hidden within the icy drifts, and Sad, brave and enduring, would be its witness, and its instrument. As night fell, the snowstorm intensified, transforming the village and surrounding forests into a world of white silence broken only by the howling wind. The cold wrapped around Sad like a living shroud, its icy fingers gnawing at her skin and seeping through layers of wool and cloth. Every exhale came out as a visible cloud of mist, curling into the night air before vanishing into the darkness. Her eyelashes froze with tiny crystals, and her hair clung to her damp cheeks, the relentless chill stealing warmth from every part of her body. Each step became an ordeal, the snow resisting her movements, clinging to her boots, slipping beneath her feet, and threatening to throw her into the unforgiving ground. Her fingers, stiff and nearly numb, struggled to adjust the edges of her cloak around her shoulders. Even the simple act of drawing a deep, fortifying breath felt arduous, as though the icy air itself sought to slow her heart. Yet despite the physical torment, Sada's mind remained sharp, a spark of defiance burning brightly within her. Every pang of frostbite and every shiver reminded her of Kofi's betrayal, the cruelty that left her exposed to the unforgiving elements. But this bitterness no longer paralyzed her. Instead, it became fuel for determination, a steadying flame that refused to be extinguished by cold or fear. The snow around her swirled in erratic patterns, forming miniature whirlwinds that danced in the moonlight. Shadows stretched and twisted across the drifts, giving life to the storm itself. Sod paused for a moment, taking in the eerie beauty of her frozen surroundings. Each snowflake sparkled like tiny gems, catching the faint light of the stars, and in their shimmer she thought she saw whispers of unseen watchers. The wind carried faint sounds, cries, whispers, and the subtle rustle of creatures moving through the drifts. It was as if the forest and the storm had taken notice of her suffering, their ancient spirits aware of the injustice she had endured. The snow, though merciless in its cold, seemed alive, observing, almost anticipating the day when the balance would be restored. Sada's thoughts turned inward to memories of warmth, laughter, and love, simpler times before betrayal had forced her into this frozen trial. But mingled with these memories was a growing awareness. She had survived this far not merely through luck but through cunning and resilience. The biting cold that numbed her skin could never touch the strength of her spirit. The thought that the snow itself could be an instrument of justice began to take root. If nature could observe, it could act, and Sod knew that her endurance would not go unnoticed. There was a promise in the wind and the drifting flakes. Those who betray the innocent cannot escape the reckoning. Hours passed, each minute stretching into eternity, yet Sod continued her silent battle. Her body ached from exposure, yet her mind envisioned a vision of revenge, not violent but a restoration of balance, a poetic justice for the cruelty she had endured. Her breath, visible in the frigid night, seemed to mingle with the spirits of the snow, each exhalation a vow that she would not perish without making her mark on the world that had tried to claim her. Even in her suffering her heart found hope, even in despair she found resolve. By the time the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon, painting the snow in soft shades of pink and gold, Sod stood tall despite her fatigue. The cold had not broken her, it had honed her, sharpened her mind, and ignited the spark of retribution that would soon awaken in the world around her. The snow, thick and glittering, seemed almost reverent now, cradling her in its icy embrace while whispering promises of what was to come. Sada's eyes, bright and unwavering, scanned the endless white landscape, her spirit no longer simply surviving, it was preparing to rise, to turn betrayal into reckoning, and to let the frozen night bear witness to the power of endurance and justice. The snow fell heavier now, not as mere flakes, but as if each piece carried intention, weaving a tapestry of motion and sound around Sod. It swirled in complex patterns, dancing in the cold wind as though alive, and each tiny crystal seemed to hum with energy. The world around her was transformed. The familiar shapes of trees, huts, and hills became ghostly silhouettes beneath the white veil. Shadows moved with the wind, not threatening but guiding, and Sod felt an invisible presence brushing against her, a force that seemed to understand her pain and determination. At first it was subtle, a light touch of warmth along her arms where frost had begun to bite, a soft pressure on her shoulders that steadied her weary form. Then came whispers, faint and indistinct at first, carried by the wind through the night. They spoke in voices she did not recognize yet felt intimately familiar, echoing the cadence of songs long forgotten but etched deep within her spirit. "Stand, endure, rise," they murmured. Each word carried weight, resonating with her heart, reminding her that she was not abandoned, that the world itself had noticed the injustice done to her. As the snow swirled around her, Sod began to perceive patterns in its motion. Whirls and spirals formed and dissolved, guiding her steps across the icy terrain. The cold, once a punishment, now felt like a test and a sharpening blade, invigorating her body with each frozen gust. Muscles she thought numbed began to respond with renewed strength. Her lungs, filled with the sharp air, drew in not just oxygen but some subtle essence of the storm itself, a strange vitality that flowed through her veins, quickening her heartbeat and clearing her mind. With each breath, each step, the snow seemed to whisper more clearly, teaching her patience, focus, and resilience. The wind carried visions in its currents, glimpses of the village below and of Kofi, the man who had abandoned her. The whispers did not speak vengeance in cruel terms, but in the language of justice. "He will learn what it means to betray," they promised, their tones neither angry nor kind but certain. Saad felt a thrill of hope rise within her, mingling with the icy air she inhaled. She realized that the snow had chosen to conspire with her, not out of favoritism but out of balance. Nature itself had witnessed her suffering and had decreed that the scales must be restored. Saad paused atop a small ridge, surveying the vast expanse of white below. The village was distant, partially hidden under drifts, yet she could see smoke rising from chimneys, tiny figures moving through the snow, and the faint flicker of torches. She sensed that the forces surrounding her were preparing the stage for a reckoning, that each flake, each icy gust, was a herald of change. The snow was no longer just a backdrop for survival, it had become a medium of magic, an extension of her will and a vessel of ancestral judgment. The whispers grew more persistent, urging her onward, teaching her subtle lessons about patience and timing. She noticed how the wind avoided obstacles in uncanny ways, nudging her past hidden patches of ice and treacherous drifts. The snow seemed to anticipate her movements, almost communicating without words, offering guidance like a silent mentor. Her body, once weakened by exposure, moved with a newfound grace, each step measured, deliberate, and filled with purpose. It was as if the snow itself were teaching her the rhythm of justice, how to move unseen yet inexorably toward the restoration of balance. Amid the flurries, Saad began to hear laughter, not cruel or mocking but soft and pure, like the echo of children playing in hidden corners of the forest. The sound lifted her spirit, reminding her of the warmth she sought to protect, her own dignity, her life, and the lessons of compassion and resilience she carried in her heart. The whispers assured her that the storm, though harsh, was a crucible, a forge in which her strength, courage, and wisdom were being tempered. Every gust that bent the trees, every icy flake that touched her cheeks, every shadow that danced across the snow, all of it conspired to teach her that her survival was not merely an accident, but a signal that the world was poised to act on her behalf. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to brush against the horizon, Saad felt transformed. The wind and snow had become allies, infusing her body with warmth and vitality that defied the winter's bite. Her resolve was no longer merely to survive, but to return, to face those who wronged her, and to let nature itself deliver the judgment that human hands had failed to provide. The whispers faded softly, leaving behind a serene stillness in which the snow seemed to glow faintly, as if acknowledging that their charge had been fulfilled. Saad inhaled deeply, feeling her spirit rise with the snow around her, ready to step back into the world and reclaim justice in a way that would leave no doubt. Betrayal would never go unanswered. Kofi returned to the village the following day, swaggering as if the night's events were nothing more than a game he had won. He told his tale in the marketplace, exaggerating Saada's supposed folly and vulnerability, laughing loudly at what he imagined was her humiliation. Villagers gathered, some out of curiosity, others out of fear, their eyes darting toward the distant slopes where the snowstorm had raged the night before. The air, crisp and still, carried a strange unease, an undercurrent that made even the boldest men pause mid-laugh and glance nervously at one another. Whispers began to spread. Mothers tugged at their children's sleeves, old men shook their heads, and even young boys who had previously played along with Kofi's arrogance, now hesitated. "Something is wrong," one elderly woman murmured, her eyes tracing the tracks that cut across the snow-dusted hills. "The snow, it is not ordinary. It carries her spirit." Others nodded, though fear made them speak softly. No one dared voice it too loudly, for superstition ran deep in the village. The elders knew well that nature often became the instrument of justice, especially when wronged hearts cried out in vain. Kofi, oblivious to the murmurs, continued boasting, unaware of the subtle signs. Outside the village, the snow clung to the trees and rocks with a strange shimmer, glinting faintly even under the weak morning sun. The wind moved with purpose, rustling branches as if whispering secrets only it could carry. Animals, normally bold in the daylight, skittishly avoided the paths Kofi walked, and the village dogs growled at seemingly empty spaces. Children playing nearby paused mid-step, sensing a presence unseen yet undeniably felt. In hushed tones, villagers spoke of the storm's unusual intensity and the patterns it left behind. It was as though the wind itself followed her, protecting her, one man said, eyes wide with reverence and fear. Another added, and that's snow. It spoke to those who dared betray her. You can feel it, can't you? Their words carried weight. Rumors of the mystical power of winter, of spirits bound to the frozen air, had circulated for generations, but no one had witnessed it so directly until now. Kofi, though mocking and loud, could not entirely ignore the unease creeping into the crowd. A cold shiver ran down his spine, one he could not explain. His boasts sounded hollow, and the laughter he had expected to hear from the villagers was muted, replaced by wary glances and tight-lipped silence. It was a subtle, creeping dread, the sense that nature itself was watching, that some force beyond human understanding had already begun to measure the scales of justice. Even from the far edges of the village, Sada's presence seemed to hum through the cold air. Though invisible, her spirit carried the promise of reckoning. The snow, once an instrument of her near demise, had become her ally, and the villagers felt it, even without knowing the full story. Kofi's arrogance now seemed fragile, like a brittle branch trembling under the weight of an unseen storm, and the villagers waited silently, knowing that the forces at play were far greater than any man's pride. As dawn broke over the snow-laden village, a hush spread across the hills and valleys, as though the land itself held its breath. Amid the glittering whiteness, Sod stirred, her body wrapped in the pure, untouched snow that had preserved her through the bitter night. The frost clung to her hair and eyelashes, sparkling like countless tiny stars scattered across the earth, yet she felt no cold. Instead, a warmth of strength coursed through her veins, a deep and enduring energy that seemed to pulse in harmony with the rhythm of the winter winds. Every shiver of the snowflakes against her skin became a reminder that the elements themselves had chosen her as their instrument of justice. Her eyes opened, reflecting the world in sharp clarity. The icy blue of the sky mirrored the brilliance of her gaze, and within it danced a subtle, otherworldly glow, a light that spoke of power tempered by resolve. The snow around her shimmered as though alive, lifting slightly from the ground in tiny swirls, sparkling with a soft luminescence. Each snowflake that landed upon her skin seemed to imbue her with energy, binding her to the land, the wind, and the frozen earth. She felt the collective whispers of the storm from the night before, not as mere echoes, but as guidance and affirmation, an ancestral voice carried in the chill. Sod rose slowly, her movements graceful, almost ethereal. The snowflakes parted around her, forming delicate patterns that glimmered in the morning light. Her hair, once wet and tangled with frost, now flowed like silver threads, reflecting the brilliance of the dawn. Her cloak of frost shimmered with iridescence, and a quiet hum seemed to emanate from her very being, a resonance of strength, wisdom, and the justice she had longed to see fulfilled. She could feel the power of the cold infusing her mind and heart, sharpening her senses and clarifying her intentions. No longer vulnerable, no longer fragile, she was a force that the land and elements themselves had sanctioned. Her thoughts turned immediately to Kofi, whose betrayal had left her at the mercy of the winter night. His cowardice, his cruelty, and his arrogance had been the catalyst for her suffering, and now, with the snow's blessing, she understood the power she held, not for mere vengeance but to restore balance and justice. The snow had not merely preserved her, it had transformed her, aligning her spirit with the elemental forces of the land. Every breath she drew felt charged with purpose, every heartbeat resonated with the energy of the frozen wilderness around her. Cinematic images of her rising from the snow came alive in her mind, the wind carrying her figure across the white expanse, glinting ice crystals falling like scattered jewels from the sky. Her eyes burned with quiet fury and clarity, reflecting the swirling snow and the pale sun above. She felt an unspoken connection to every snow-covered branch, every frozen leaf, every icy crystal that caught the light. The snow had not only returned her to life, it had granted her insight, a strategic mind sharpened by the trials she had endured. Sod extended her hands and tiny spirals of frost danced around her fingers, responding to her will. The snow seemed to bend subtly to her presence, whispering that she could use its power to confront the injustice done to her. She walked deliberately toward the edge of the forest, leaving a trail of glimmering frost in her wake. Each step left a mark of power and determination, a sign that she was no longer a mere victim. The land itself seemed to acknowledge her as its champion, as the wind rose slightly, circling her, carrying her intentions like invisible banners across the village. With her strength restored and her spirit unbroken, Sod began planning her return. The bitter night that had sought to end her life had instead forged her into something new, a woman capable of reclaiming her dignity, confronting betrayal, and restoring justice. Her eyes flickered toward the village, where Kofi now waited unknowingly, underestimating the forces that had conspired to transform her. She smiled faintly, a cold, radiant smile that promised reckoning. The snow had given her more than life. It had given her the power of resurrection, the clarity of purpose, and the unyielding resolve to ensure that those who wronged her would face the consequences of their deeds. The first flakes of snow began to drift from the gray sky as Sod approached the village, each one shimmering like a tiny shard of moonlight. The cold was no longer her enemy. It moved with her, swirling around her feet and lifting slightly as though bowing to her presence. Villagers paused in their daily routines, frozen in disbelief at the sudden, unnatural descent of snow during a season when the land should have been thawing. The flakes danced in the air with a deliberate grace, forming delicate spirals and patterns that seemed almost to spell messages only Sod could understand. Children stopped mid-play, their wide eyes reflecting wonder and a touch of fear, while elders muttered prayers under their breath, sensing that the spirits of the winter had come to deliver justice. As she entered the village square, the river that cut through the heart of the settlement seemed to respond to her presence. Its waters froze instantly, capturing the sunlight in a lattice of crystalline beauty. The villagers gasped at the sudden transformation, some whispering that the river itself had recognized Sada's power. Birds and small animals moved strangely, avoiding certain paths and congregating in unexpected places, as if guided by an invisible force. The air itself carried a resonant hum, a low vibration that made the ground beneath tremble slightly, a reminder that the elements were aligned with her will. Kofi, oblivious at first, emerged from the central hut with a smug expression, expecting to see Sod humbled or hiding. His confidence faltered as he noticed the unnatural snowfall, the frozen river, and the peculiar alignment of birds and animals. A chill ran down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the air. It was the icy weight of fear settling in his chest. He turned to the villagers, seeking reassurance, but found only wide eyes and tense silence. Mothers clutched their children closer, men lowered their heads, and even the chief looked on with a mix of awe and apprehension. Kofi realized too late that Sod was no longer the vulnerable woman he had abandoned. She had returned as a force beyond ordinary human understanding. The snow around Sod thickened, forming an ethereal cloak that shimmered with frost and light. She raised her arms, and the flakes seemed to obey her motion, swirling in arcs and spirals that encircled Kofi like spectral chains. The villagers could see her eyes gleaming with authority, reflecting the sky, the frozen river, and the brilliance of the snow's magic. Sada's presence was both beautiful and terrifying, a living embodiment of the cold justice she had earned through suffering and survival. Every breath she drew seemed to carry the whisper of the storm, a subtle sound that spoke of reckoning and balance restored. Kofi's knees shook as he attempted to speak, but no words formed. His mouth opened and closed, stammering helplessly, while Sada's voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the swirling snow. "You thought the night could silence me. You thought the cold could end me. But the snow does not serve cruelty. It serves justice." The villagers flinched at the power in her words, sensing that this was not merely a confrontation but a divine orchestration of nature itself. The snow continued to transform the village square. Trees lifted their branches as if bowing to her presence, while the frozen river formed intricate patterns resembling protective runes. The wind bent around Sod, carrying whispers of the storm from the night she had been abandoned, amplifying her authority and her connection to the mystical forces that had preserved and transformed her. Kofi staggered backward, the fear evident in his every movement. Even his bravado, which had carried him so far in life, crumbled under the weight of the unnatural phenomena that surrounded him. With deliberate steps, Sod approached him, each footfall leaving a thin layer of frost that glimmered in the early light. The villagers held their breath as the wind swirled, lifting strands of her hair like silver threads that seemed to connect her directly to the storm. She stopped before Kofi, her gaze unwavering. The snow rose slightly at her command, forming subtle barriers and coils around him, a warning and a symbol of the balance he had disrupted. "Your betrayal has consequences," she said softly, yet the snow itself seemed to echo her words, rattling gently against the frozen riverbank, amplifying the judgment that awaited him. Kofi fell to his knees, pleading silently, but the snow did not relent. Its beauty was terrifying, a stark reminder that the natural world honors courage and punishes deceit. The villagers watched as Sod extended her hand, her eyes blazing with calm authority, commanding the storm to freeze Kofi in the immensity of its magical embrace. He could no longer deny the power she now wielded, the cold, radiant justice that she had earned. The snow, the wind, the frozen river, All bore witness to the reckoning, and the village itself seemed to exhale, acknowledging that the wronged had finally returned, unstoppable and just. The village woke to a transformed world. Snow clung to rooftops and twisted branches, sparkling like shards of diamond under the pale winter sun. Kofi shivered violently as he attempted to leave his hut, only to find that the ground beneath him was icy and unsteady, betraying every step. It was not merely cold, it was a biting frost that seemed to reach into his bones, a punishment that the snow had designed to reflect the chill of his betrayal. Each breath he drew clouded before him, carrying with it a whisper of accusation, as though the wind itself had been given voice by Sada's return. Every object around Kofi responded to the subtle judgment of the winter. Doors refused to open smoothly, tilting awkwardly, and windows fogged with condensation in patterns that resembled eyes watching his every move. The fire in his hearth sputtered and smoked, failing to offer warmth, while snowflakes crept through the cracks, melting into rivulets that traced icy paths across the floor. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, dancing on walls and bending with intent, as though the house itself had become a mirror of Kofi's guilt. Villagers passing by paused, sensing that justice was being enacted quietly but powerfully, even if they could not yet see the full extent of the mystical forces at work. Kofi's isolation intensified as the snow seemed to create invisible boundaries around him. Animals that once roamed freely now avoided his path, moving instead toward the warmth of the village center or the shelter of the trees that had witnessed Sada's transformation. Even the wind, once a simple breath of air, carried the whispers of wronged daughters and betrayed hearts. Every swirl of frost and drift of snow seemed to murmur a reminder of his deceit, a voice only he could hear, echoing endlessly through the stillness of the winter morning. The cold was no longer just a physical sensation, it was moral, spiritual, and unyielding. Meanwhile, Sad moved freely through the village, her steps leaving delicate trails of sparkling frost that reflected the sunlight, highlighting her dignity and unshakable strength. Her presence contrasted starkly with Kofi's suffering. Where he experienced discomfort, she radiated warmth and authority. Snowflakes curved gracefully around her, parting respectfully, as though the elements themselves recognized her power and her innocence. She did not need to speak. Her posture, her calm gaze, and the subtle aura of command she exuded were sufficient to demonstrate that she alone had earned the favor of the winter's mystical force. As Kofi stumbled through the courtyard, the snow whispered louder, each gust forming a chorus of invisible voices that replayed his betrayal. The frost stiffened his movements, freezing locks of his hair in place, biting at the edges of his clothing, and coating his shoes with a slick glaze that made every step a struggle. Even the simplest tasks, lighting a fire, opening a door, gathering supplies, became exercises in frustration and awareness of his wrongdoing. The snow's punishment was precise. It allowed survival but demanded humility, reflection, and recognition of the harm he had caused. Saad observed quietly from the riverbank, the wind carrying her voice faintly to Kofi as a reminder that justice does not need to be loud to be absolute. Every flicker of light on the snow, every sparkle in the frost, mirrored her resilience. She had endured betrayal, harshness, and near death, yet here she stood, untouched, a living testament to the power of courage, virtue, and the mystical alignment of nature with morality. The village watched in awe, understanding that the winter itself had become both arbiter and protector, a silent, relentless enforcer of balance and truth. The village, once silent under the shadow of betrayal and fear, began to breathe again as the snow's wrath subsided. The frozen rivers slowly thawed, releasing gentle streams that sparkled in the sunlight, carrying the subtle memory of the justice that had been enacted. Birds returned to the branches of baobab and acacia trees, their songs a delicate accompaniment to the renewed life stirring in the village. Villagers emerged from their homes, rubbing frostbitten hands but eyes wide with awe, having witnessed the unparalleled power of nature intertwined with virtue. Conversations buzzed with reverence and humility as they recounted the events of the bitter winter, the whispers of the wind, and the unstoppable rise of Saad from near death to authority. Saad walked through the village with quiet grace, her steps leaving faint, glittering trails of frost that shimmered like traces of the magic that had aided her. Children ran to her side, their fingers brushing the sparkling paths, sensing the lingering magic without understanding it fully. Women offered small smiles and bows of respect, their voices soft with admiration as they acknowledged her courage. Even the elders, who had once doubted her and her resilience, now nodded solemnly, recognizing that the snow had revealed truths that human eyes alone might have missed. Saad had not only survived the cold and betrayal but had turned the elements themselves into a testament of justice, earning the silent reverence of everyone who had once witnessed her suffering. Kofi, now humbled and pale from frost and fear, stood in the center of the village square. His boastful demeanor had melted away like ice under the gentle warmth of the returning sun. The villagers avoided direct confrontation with him, though their glares spoke volumes. No one needed to speak the word justice. It had been written in the snow, in the frozen rivers, in the shifting winds that had followed Sod. Kofi's isolation had transformed into public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He realized that cruelty and betrayal, no matter how cunningly concealed, were never beyond the reach of accountability, especially when met by courage and virtue aligned with the forces of nature. Villagers began to speak among themselves, recounting lessons they had often overlooked. Envy leads to ruin, betrayal invites consequence, and true courage can bend even the harshest elements to right the scales of justice. Mothers told their children the story of Sod and the bitter winter, emphasizing the power of resilience, morality, and the unseen forces that watch over the wronged. Each retelling carried not just the tale of vengeance, but the moral weight of responsibility, integrity, and respect for one another. The village itself seemed transformed, no longer indifferent or silent in the face of cruelty, but vigilant and attentive, imbued with a collective understanding that justice could manifest in ways beyond human imagination. Sod, for her part, remained calm and composed. Her experience had imbued her with a quiet wisdom, a knowledge that strength was not measured merely by survival, but by the way one allowed their trials to shape them into a beacon for others. She spoke little, but her presence conveyed lessons louder than words could achieve. Villagers approached her, seeking guidance not only in matters of survival and daily life but in understanding the deeper truths of justice, empathy, and courage. Her story became a living testament, a moral compass for those who had once faltered in the shadows of envy and fear. As evening fell, the sun glinted off the last patches of snow, casting golden light across the village. The fields, once dull and frost-bitten, now glimmered with renewed promise. Children laughed and ran through the melted pathways, their voices mingling with the distant calls of birds returning to their nests. The elders shared tales of Sada's bravery and the snow's intervention, passing down not just a story, but a cultural anchor, a moral touchstone that would guide generations to come. In every glance at the thawing landscape, in every flicker of frost lingering on the trees, the village was reminded that courage, integrity, and the alignment of nature's justice could restore balance, respect, and hope to even the coldest of hearts. Years had passed since that bitter winter, yet the village never forgot the tale of Sod and the snow that had risen in her defense. Parents told their children of the young woman abandoned to the frozen wilderness, a story that carried both warning and inspiration. He left her to freeze, but the snow brought her back in revenge, they would say, emphasizing the mystical power that had protected the righteous and punished the cruel. Each telling of the story was accompanied by reverent silence, as villagers remembered the wind's whispers, the glittering frost, and the awe-inspiring return of Sod, transformed by both nature and her own unyielding spirit. The snow, once seen as merely a rare and treacherous phenomenon, became a symbol of justice in the collective memory of the people. It was no longer merely cold flakes falling from the sky, but a messenger that could recognize virtue, guide the wronged, and balance the scales where human judgment had failed. Farmers, when clearing the fields after winter, would sometimes pause, eyes drawn to patterns in the snowflakes, wondering if the wind carried Sada's strength within it. Children, playing in the frost, would whisper stories to one another, daring to imagine the snow itself listening, rewarding courage and punishing selfishness. Every snowfall was a reminder that justice need not always come from human hands, but could be orchestrated by forces older than memory itself. Sod, now older and revered as a figure of wisdom, walked through the village often at dawn. Her presence inspired awe and gratitude among those who knew her story, and respect among those who had only heard it. Villagers approached her to hear firsthand the lessons she had learned, how to endure betrayal with dignity, and how to allow one's pain to shape not bitterness, but power tempered with justice. She spoke little, letting her actions and calm resolve convey the lessons her words could not fully capture. The gentle falling snow, reflecting in her eyes, became a companion to her teachings, and many said that even in her silence, Sod embodied the moral of the tale, that resilience aligned with integrity can summon extraordinary forces to correct wrongs. The unfaithful Kofi, whose betrayal had once brought darkness to the village, was remembered not merely with shame, but as a cautionary figure. Parents pointed to his story when warning children against cruelty, deception, and envy. But more importantly, his punishment through the snow served as a tangible, almost living symbol of balance restored. Villagers spoke of the frost forming around objects he coveted, the whispering winds carrying the echoes of his guilt, and the biting cold that seemed to follow him even in summer memories. Through Kofi's failure and Sada's triumph, the village learned that actions have consequences, and that nature in its mysterious wisdom could serve as arbiter when human morality faltered. Cinematic imagery filled every retelling, snowflakes drifting lazily in the morning sun, covering the rooftops of huts in a shimmering blanket. Children ran through the fields, their laughter carrying on the cold breeze, echoing the joy that had returned to the village long after Sada's confrontation. The wind carried stories from one home to the next, as though the spirits of the bitter winter still lingered, reminding everyone of the power of courage and righteousness. At dusk, the snow would catch the final rays of sunlight, turning the village into a golden-white panorama, a living painting that testified to the lasting impact of Sada's strength and the supernatural justice that had answered her plight. Even the elders who had once doubted, who had whispered about the mysterious snow and its unnatural interventions, now spoke openly of its lessons. They encouraged the young to respect the elements, to act with virtue, and to honor the balance between human life and nature's enduring watch. Songs were composed, dances performed, and stories recited in gatherings, each celebrating not only Sada's bravery but the way the snow had mirrored her resolve and amplified it into a moral force for the entire community. In every corner of the village, the legacy endured. Frosty mornings reminded people of vigilance and fairness. The sparkling snowflakes became metaphors in poetry and song, and Sada's figure, often seen standing tall against the pale horizon, became a living emblem of resilience, justice, and the mysterious, nurturing power of nature. As the wind whispered through the trees and snow fell softly on the rooftops, villagers felt a quiet reassurance that justice, though sometimes slow, was always possible. Thus, the tale passed from generation to generation, not only as a story of revenge and power, but as a guiding principle for life. Courage combined with virtue can awaken the world's hidden forces, ensuring that wrongs are corrected, balance restored, and the innocent are protected. And in every snowfall that blanketed the village, there lingered the memory of Sad, standing strong, radiant, and vindicated, her spirit entwined with the wind, the frost, and the eternal lesson that no betrayal, however cruel, could withstand the might of courage and the wisdom of nature.